Hey, hey, what is going on with y'all, man? It's Black Balloon, and I'm coming back with another video, so y'all already know what's going on. Alright, y'all, look, real quick, we got a really interesting video today, right? So as you saw by the title, this video is going to be about child sacrifice altars, Jekyll Island here in Georgia, the Federal Reserve, where it was basically written up and, put into motion here on Jekyll Island back in 1910. We're also going to kind of tie in the conspiracy of the Titanic going down, being sunk with multiple bankers on that ship who were basically opposed to the Federal Reserve that we have now today, that is basically our monetary and banking system, right? In order for something, in order to have a system like this in place for so long, to basically, keep people in debt, to make money debt, to make debt money, all of the monetary stuff that you have going on throughout the Federal Reserve and our country, right? In order to keep a system running that long, in order to basically keep people under a system like that, keep people just, chasing their own tails to get rich one day. Basically, in order to have that kind of system, you have to utilize the satanic and mystical energies from basically the occult. You have to utilize those energies in a ritual, which is why, just to give you a little bit of juice on this video, which is why the Federal Reserve, I think it was a house by the Rockefellers, they actually have a house built on top of an old Indian Canaanite child sacrifice altar. Now, this altar, this was like by the Nephilim. This is really ancient times, and it was giants that basically they lived during the time when this altar was active, when they were basically sacrificing children to the god Molech. And the Rockefellers of today, the banking family, they built a house on top of that old Canaanite altar. And so the reason I'm saying that, in order for the Federal Reserve to have ran so long and to have this kind of monetary system running so long, they used the energies, the satanic energies of that altar. They ran a ritual, which is why they built the house on top of it. You have to understand, they built a house on top of a demonic sacrifice altar, people. That is the most demonic that you can get. You don't even know what the spirit world can do to you physically. We don't even have to talk about mentally. You don't even know what the spirit world can do to you physically. You have no idea. I don't think the dumbest person in the world would actually build a house on top of what used to be a live sacrifice altar. And you're going to listen to this video. The skit was actually done by the late Rob Skiba. Rob Skiba, he died, if I'm not mistaken, from COVID-19 about a year or two ago. I don't know if it was 2 years ago or not, actually. But Rob Skiba basically, he was known for mostly being a flat earther. Now, he interviewed a guy named Tim Bentz. Some of y'all might know him, but he basically goes into really, a lot of detail about the Canaanite altars, and he gives his kind of testimony on how God used him to go and do away with these altars and do away with the demonic energy in that area that's associated with the altar. Because as long as the altar is still there, if it's not done away by God, it is still an active altar, But I'm not even going to talk about it much. I'm just going to let him do the talking. And plus, I have a few other things to show y'all in this video. So this is going to be a really interesting video. I was actually excited to do this video and bring it to y'all myself because this is completely new content. I hadn't did a video on this on my old channel, but what got me around to doing this video was the fact that I was actually researching a whole nother video, because it's like two things here in Georgia that I wanted to talk about because they're known on a national scale. And that was Lake Lanier, marine spirits, and then I somehow floated into this Jekyll Island and Canaanite altar thing. So I was like, oh, I have to do that video. Also, I'm going to bring that marine spirit video back to the channel as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about Lake Lanier. And just the whole marine spirit thing. But anyways, not to get off topic, what we're talking about right now. So I'm gonna shut up, let y'all check these clips out. Really, really interesting video, man. I hope y'all like this video. Use your ears and just listen for me, and let me know, what y'all got to go say in the comments. I'm gonna come back in this video after a couple of clips just to talk about a few things, so y'all already know what's going on. Check this out.
Almost every country I go to now, I'm running into unraveling the things that are binding up the people or binding up the land. It's usually related to both. And a few years back, I made a trip to the Middle East. While I was there, I was doing a lot of ministry with just typical preaching and teaching and counseling, and it was not really planned to be involved in any way with archaeology type stuff. But I had a word from the Lord to go meet with some of the people that worked in the antiquities department, and some of my friends that lived in the country, they just took me to meet some of the people that were in charge of that area for the nation. And I began to inquire about things that were biblical and things that were archaeological. Not all archaeologists and not all university type folks want to make that correlation, but I find a lot of times in the countries in the Middle East, they know their history as it relates to the Bible, and they're not as averse to that. But I didn't expect some of what I got invited to. And they had just done an archaeological dig that had been going on for a while, and I was asked if I would like to go see the dig while it was actually in operation. And they had identified about 22 or 23 layers of civilization, and they were had dug down to about the 16th layer. So they were estimating that they were down to about 4,000 to 5,000 years, and they had discovered quite an elaborate, what may end up being a city. But they were pulling pottery, shards, just all kinds of things from that layer. And an ancient altar was uncovered that was quite large. It appeared to be a solid stone, looked like a granite type of stone, and it was approximately 18 foot in diameter and about 8 to 9 foot thick. And because it was so unusual, they had taken their time to work around it and uncover it completely and intact. And it had some ancient inscriptions on it, so they felt like this is identifiable, and that they were identifying it as the Canaanite altar that was approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years old. What I was told by them at that time was that from the moment they had uncovered it, unusual things had started happening in the territory, and especially to those that were nearby or involved in the dig. A lot of people got sick, not necessarily directly to that. It was not easy to identify that was the reason, but people that had been working on it, people in the area, folks that were associated with it coming and going, a lot of people just started having great difficulty. Terrorist-type activity and illegal trafficking of things began to increase exponentially in the territory. The military and the police were on alert for almost things constantly, and all of that seemed unrelated to them, to what they had uncovered. But because it had increased quite a bit, I began speaking to a couple of the local ministers and a couple of the folks that worked for the government, and then the antiquities folks. And I suggested to them that there might be a spiritual problem going on, that what they've uncovered has a spiritual correlation, and even though it's that old, it may be releasing something that's affecting all of these other areas. I wasn't trying to say that was set in stone, but I felt like there was a strong possibility of that. And my instruction to them was, the difficulty with antiquities and with museum type things is we want to put them and value them as something of an antiquity, and we want to put them in a museum to show them off. But in a case of an altar like that, on this altar, a socket type piece that they think was probably made out of wood would fit on top of it, and they had an inscription that showed a display of it, so they knew that it was a blood sacrifice type altar. I simply suggested that one of the biblical responses to this type of thing was to break it, and that there was a reason why God told those that were in covenant with Him to break it. That it was not something to be put on display. It was not something to value as an antiquity. It was something that was warring with the nature of God, and it's a land issue. If you do not want to consider dealing with it in the way the Scriptures prescribe, then you are, in essence, allowing the land that it's attached to and the demonic realms that it's attached to have access and free reign. And so we looked at the boundaries of that nation and the trouble they were having with other nations and just especially terrorism and trafficking of things that were illegal. And I suggested to them that all the places it appeared where they were having that type of activity today related to known altars in times past. Some of them not visible or found today. Some of them, you just know they were there at one time. But this one was in a spot that was identified with a Canaanite city. And I said, if this is a Canaanite city, as you say, and this is a Canaanite altar as you've identified, then you're releasing the demonic realm, and if you do not obey the biblical instructions, you may be coming into agreement with it, and you're going to lose your land. And I've been looking at this problem as part of the displacement of things that are righteous or things that are holy, or why we're warring with the spirit of the world so much. And occasionally it seems like God's people, even though we know we're crying out with the things of God and we know we're speaking scriptural truths, that sometimes it seems like we're not gaining ground and the spirit of the world is. And evil is pressing in on every side on God's people in many nations around the world. And so I began considering and asking God for some wisdom on this, that is it possible that in our day, even though we don't necessarily have altars set out in front of us or in every high place like some of the biblical references are, they don't look like we think they'll look, but they may still be there. And so I know that we're dealing with the demonic realms in many of the same ways, and a lot of wisdom has come on doing deliverance and praying against that type of stuff. But I began to ask the Lord, do we have a territorial problem, and is the authority that you've given to your people limited if we do not deal with an altar that happens to be in a spot and we have not considered that it was as valid today as it was 4,000 or 5,000 years ago? And the answer I received was emphatically yes, that God's instructions to tear these things down, to break them, to cut down the Asherah poles, that there was not a time limit on that, say, where he said do that for a few thousand years and then don't worry about it after that. He said when you find them, do this. And that appears to be just as valid today as it was in the scriptural instructions when it was given. So I began to just really press into this and pray and came to the conclusion, God, nobody that I know of is actually doing this. Even the ones that are out there somewhere, we either don't know where they are, or if they've ever been discovered, we just ignore them. You know, a lot of people will pray when they hear about something that is occultic going on in a territory, but they don't always attribute it that it might be something that's generational and goes back for many, many generations in certain places on the earth. So I just said, what do I do as a believer with an 18-foot round stone, and I have no sledgehammer big enough and no wrecking ball big enough, and I'm dealing with people that are secular and have an interest in putting it in a museum. Like, Jesus, what do we do? So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name is John, and when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. He was not a very spiritual guy, so he respected it, but he just kind of told me right off the bat, I don't really understand prayer and intercession, that kind of stuff. He said, I believe in God, but I'm not very spiritual. Then I said, well, that's okay. You're still important. There's something you know that I need to know. And I said, I don't know if you'll understand it, but the King of Kings set this appointment up. There's something you know I need to know. And I'll pray for you, and I'll pray for the business here, and I'll pray for whatever it is that God wants, but just please attend to this as something very, very important, and thank you for your time. So we started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. Mm-hmm. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place very often anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. So it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, and just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out, walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum. And he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was, marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and that one was they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all got some kind of a plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them. And they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low-key and almost like a cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. He just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about, because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of Native history, and I have some Native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas.
All right, y'all. So I found this article online about the Timucua tribe, right? Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Not even sure if he pronounced it right. I don't know. Look, but I wanted to come in real quick because he said he didn't know anything. He hadn't heard anything about this tribe, about this native tribe, right? And so when I did some research and just tried to go back and find some history about this tribe, I came upon this article, and this is probably why most people don't know about it when it relates back to Jekyll Island and the history of it, and the tribes, the native tribes that basically lived there way before this whole Federal Reserve thing happened and blah blah blah. This is where the altar comes from. This was the time that the sacrifice altars in that area when they were alive, right? When they were active. So it says we don't know very much about the religion since they kept many of their beliefs secret from the Europeans. Additionally, French and Spanish settlers often destroyed the evidence of the religion because they wanted to convert them to Christianity, which is typical, right? So they said what we do know is that the Timucua worship the sun and the moon, which was kind of like most ancient civilizations back then, right? They worshiped multiple gods. They worshiped the sun. They worshiped the moon, so on and so on. And then the tribe also had their kind of like, their doctors of how we have today. But back then it was kind of different because I don't think we have doctors or anything that can predict the future and curse people. These sound like witches and warlocks. You know what I'm saying? Because they said they were called shamans. Shamans could predict the future, curse people, control the weather, perform blessings, and cure people. That almost, in a sense, you know what I'm saying? That almost sounds like God. But anyway, we know when someone or a being is capable of that on Earth, they're definitely a witch or some kind of warlock, because you're not predicting the future and controlling the weather and cursing people all in one. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, that was their kind of like shamans, their little witch doctors or whatever they had in that civilization at that time, right? So it also goes on to say that the tribe they believed in omens, which is kind of like still the same to today, where a lot of people still believe in this kind of stuff. If you see snakes and you see owls and blah blah blah, y'all already know how that goes. And then it also gets a little bit more interesting where it says conversion to Catholicism. With the end of the 1500s, a large amount of Spanish missionaries had established missions near the largest Timucua settlements. The Timucua were taught Spanish, baptized, and evidence of their native religion were destroyed. All right. So the missionaries are the primary source of the written accounts of the Timucua. So basically we get nothing but lies. And by 1595, 75% of their population had decreased. All right. So that was basically a little history on the Timucua tribe. Once again, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it is what it is. So look, we're just gonna go ahead and continue on with the video. So with that being said, check this out.
So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said it actually helped us identify the native history because the club itself had almost erased that. And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, just artifacts that they had found and pottery shards and things and seashells that they had. And he showed me all their stuff in the museum. He shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of a bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said, oh, no. They were the Timia because they're well established along the Florida and Georgia coast. And he said, we got a lot of stuff in 3 or 4 states about them, and they were quite prolific at one time. So he said, we know they're Native Americans. I said, well, all right, what else you got? He said, well, we got some skeletons. He said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, you don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were, and they just uncovered them to where they were visible, and then they built the museum on top of them. They did basically the same thing with the museum that the Jekyll Island guys had done with their houses. They put a piece of plexiglass over the burial site so you could see it, but they were still trying to respect where the bones were and not move them. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And they knew they were chiefs just from different things that were buried with them. So all of a sudden I look and I realize, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. And I was like, well, that doesn't seem like a normal Native American, especially the tribes that I'm familiar with. He said all the Timucuas were unusually tall, even the women. And he said we found other skeletons and parts of bones out in the grounds, and he said we've got pretty good evidence that nearly all of them were extraordinarily tall. And I said, well, how do you explain that in relation to other tribes on the Atlantic coast who were not? He said, I don't know. It is an unusual anomaly. He said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that you might want to see. It's actually the copy of the original. We've got it under lock and key. So I got a painting that actually shows the Indians from a group of French colonists that came to the United States before it was the U.S. This was right after Columbus. He said that it was the first colony of French folks that came over to try to establish a colony on the coast. And he said they landed in Jekyll Island, and they had some interaction with these Indians, and then they got so appalled by what they saw and witnessed that they fled at night and ended up in San Augustine, Florida, and established that city. So I said, were they the Huguenots who were the French group that established San Augustine? He said, yes. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of ceremony, and it's got the fire, and it's a typical, either they're having a party or they're having a war scene, and it has some things with the weapons. So I said, gosh, this has got some weapons in it that clearly validates the archaeology that they found. And then I see an altar. And I'm going, I don't know of a Native American tribe anywhere in the country. I know some that had log houses or high places or worshipped, nature in some way or had totem poles or that kind of stuff. But this one has a stone altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture, and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on, because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the details, two of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar.
Mm.
And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. I said, are you sure this is Native Americans and not some kind of colony that came from over there? And he was convinced they were native. And I said, well, I'd like to show you some things on a few websites that identify artifacts in the Middle East countries, and especially Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan area, and some of those spots where there's some of these ancient groups. And I said, this type of altar, this type of religious ceremony, and some of these weapons, I've seen them before over there. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know, where is this altar? And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? I often pray over these things, and it's very beneficial for the land and for the country and for the people. Can I go to this altar and see it? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was.
All right, y'all. So that last part that he said was definitely very interesting. Just, how he said, who would be crazy enough to actually build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? And then he said, well, Rockefeller was. And if you look at this guy, you could almost tell he's like not even human. He has to be a fallen angel as a human. Has to be. Look at him. Look at some of the pictures of John D. Rockefeller. Zoom in on his face and get close to his eyes. Obviously, all we have are pictures, and some of them are grainy. But this guy looks like he is highly possessed. Or if he's not possessed, he is definitely a fallen angel of some sort. Or whatever, because if you think about it, to have that kind of access, and he knew that it was a blood sacrifice altar underneath the house. They built the house on top of it. So meaning there was access to it, and it probably is still access to it. There's probably a door that leads to it where they run rituals, where they do whatever, where who knows, or at least at that time, that's what they were doing. They may not be doing it now, but back then in that time in the early 1900s, it was taking place. And then if we want to tie in the whole conspiracy about J.P. Morgan and, the Titanic, and whether or not he canceled his, rather or not he canceled himself being on that boat, because if you research it, you're not going to find anything that really tells you, he canceled his trip just so, he knew everything that was going to happen. It was 3 hours before, because I think that's like the big, quote unquote conspiracy around it, that JP Morgan, he canceled his trip just 3 hours before the Titanic took off into this like sea of a bunch of icebergs, and it didn't really have anything on the boat safety wise, just in case anything like that happened. Basically, it was like, a death mission, a death trip. And the fact that There wasn't a single Rothschild on the boat. There wasn't any J.P. Morgans on the boat. You know, obviously J.P. Morgan himself canceled his trip supposedly right before it happened. And then boom, the Titanic sinks, I think in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. And a bunch of bankers that were, you know, supposedly against the Federal Reserve, they die on that boat. The Titanic. Now, you're not going to find any information on the internet that dates back to the early 1900s that says any of those guys were against the Titanic, but obviously they could easily scrub that kind of information off the net, considering that existed before the internet. The internet didn't exist before when this stuff happened. It was just all in the papers, right? So you never really know. Obviously, you know, at the end of the day, we know we know the truth behind it. And we can also clearly see that there's only one group that's responsible, and that's the Jesuits. It's the Jesuits. It's just, you know, clearly here as it states in the text that I got up on the screen. After they got their bank, they got World War I months later. And that sounds like, you know, the military order of the Jesus Society, of the Jesuits, because that's what they are. They're a military order, basically, and that's how they operate. They infiltrate, and this is just prime example of how the Jesuits would move as far as doing what they have to do in order to create the central bank here in America back when they did. And that meant taking out three of the most wealthy, guys that were opposed to the Federal Reserve. I don't think they all were bankers, but I think they did have ties in it, whether it was political or, governmental, whatever, or rather it was in the government. But their names were here in the text. It was Benjamin Guggenheim, don't know how you pronounce that, Issa Strauss, and Jacob Astor. Those were the three guys that were some of the wealthiest at their time. And they were killed on the Titanic when that ship was sunk on purpose. There were no lifeboats, and a bunch of other things, like I said, that basically turned the trip into a death trip. There were nothing there safety-wise, just in case of an emergency. So we know that's no coincidence, and they did that in order to take those guys out so they could create the central bank here in America without anyone opposing the system, and things would go their way. So now we could clearly see the sinister involvement behind everything that is the foundation of this country, at least as far as, the monetary system goes in the Federal Reserve, right? So I'm not going to keep this part too long. Thought this was a pretty good video to bring to y'all. Definitely hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all haven't heard of this stuff before, let me know what y'all think in the comments. Even if y'all have heard this stuff before, I'm pretty sure a lot of us have heard about the Titanic, because there's a bunch of different conspiracies rather or not the Titanic was actually swapped. If it was actually the real Titanic, there's a bunch of stuff around it, but I didn't want to take the focus off of what this video really was about and go all the way into the whole Titanic thing. But I just wanted to mostly tie it back into the Federal Reserve, how it was started, and the history with the Jekyll Island thing and the sacrifice altars, because everything is a lot more deeper than we know. And everything has a spiritual meaning and side to it, rather you know it or not. So, which is why I always just preach the spiritual side of life, because it has a hand in every single thing that we do. And I really do mean everything that we do, even the history, of this world, everything we thought we knew. It ties back into the spiritual world as well, which is why spiritual warfare is very important. All right. So y'all already know, man. Once again, let me know what y'all think in the comments. It is Black Balloon, and I'm going to see y'all soon. All right.